BSides DC would like to thank all of our sponsors, and a special thank you to all of our speakers, volunteers, and organizers.
Thank you everyone for coming to my talk on influence operations. My name is Daniel Gordon. I am a Lockheed Martin employee. I'm a contractor to the Department of Defense Cybercrime Center, or DC3. And Halloween is this week, and I think it makes sense that I'm going to work zombies heavily into this presentation, so here we go. A couple things about me. I am a threat intelligence analyst and incident responder by profession. I published an article in War on the Rocks on this topic, and I have a degree in political science and modeling and simulation, which has actually come in pretty handy for this, and obviously I take myself very seriously. All right, so let's get started. I did want to acknowledge a number of folks who contributed content to this presentation. So there's a number of people in the infosec community, as we refer to ourselves, who are kind of focused on this issue. I wanted to recognize a lot of researchers who I encourage you to follow. These are people who track campaigns, who track activity professionally and, better than professionally. And I also want to recognize Rob Kneck and Carl Miller, who contributed key ideas to the presentation. So here we go. I'm going to go through some definitions because not everyone's familiar with influence operations. I'm going to talk about why this matters for folks in infosec. For those of you in infosec, I'm going to talk about social media and how it's kind of changed the game. I'm going to go through frameworks because they help us explain and understand this problem, and it's very chaotic and very complex, so the frameworks are helpful. And I'm going to go over state actors because they're kind of the thing that is most concerning, most interesting in this field. And also, finally, response options, because talking about it is great, but we want to do things to stop it or to counter it or to deal with it properly. So let's talk definitions. First off, disinformation is false things that people are spreading on purpose, whereas misinformation is things that people are spreading without knowing that it is false. These are both problems that are part of this issue, but they are separate, they are different. The deliberate spread of false information is a much harder problem to tackle because you have to make them stop, and not everyone who's doing it on purpose is going to stop. I also want to emphasize that true content can be part of an influence operation, so that means that, hey, I am spreading something that is factual, but it's framed in a way that doesn't give the full picture or makes it seem worse or better than it might be, or I'm giving it without context, so now it has a different meaning, or maybe this is private information, maybe this is emails that are on your network that are being shared publicly. Hey, that's not public information, that's maybe embarrassing. It's still true, but it's now part of an influence operation. To explain influence operations, which I've already been talking about, but let's actually dive into it. The easiest way is synonyms. So this is a whole list of synonyms of influence operations. Coordinated inauthentic behavior is the name for it that Facebook uses. Lots of other folks use these in other ways, but these are all kind of talking about the same thing. There is a possibly made-up story that Eskimos have a lot of words for snow. And I want to point out that the last 5 terms on this list are from Russian. And my explanation for the reason for that is that Russians have a lot of interaction with influence operations the same way Eskimos would presumably have a lot of interaction with snow. Their government does a lot of this kind of thing. And they do it domestically, they do it externally, but it's in their playbook and it's going to continue to be in their playbook. So let's keep going. All right, so why did this matter to you guys? There are a number of different reasons, but the big one is that a big portion of what we do in our life now happens on the internet. It's the way a lot of people work. It's how they interact with each other socially. It's how we take in information. The internet plays a huge role in our life now. And when things happen on social media or on the internet, that can have real world consequences. So here on the far right is a military exercise called Jade Helm that basically had to be canceled because of conspiracy theories. These other two examples are where people died from things that happened on social media. That's part of why it matters. More specifically for you guys, it matters because, as I mentioned before, content on a network that has been hacked and released is now part of an influence operation, and that is a tactic in the tool set of adversaries now. This particular example is some Russian GRU agents that were arrested while attempting to hack into the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And when they were captured along with their equipment, it became obvious from looking at stored wireless networks on the laptops that they had been involved in attempts against a lot of these other organizations. Now, if you look through this list, there's a lot of disinformation around this, but more specifically, there's been a lot of leaked content from hacks. So this is part of their playbook. This is something you guys should think about if you're defending a network, that folks are going to conduct an influence operation using your data if that is part of their goal. And it clearly is for the Russian GRU. This is a false flag example, and false flags are also influence operations. They're interesting to us because infosec practitioners are kind of the target of this kind of activity. So this particular one was Olympic Destroyer, so that's targeting the Olympics in South Korea. This was definitely a false flag attempt. They used code similar to code previously used by a suspected North Korean actor. They slapped a rich header on top of some of their executables. They were using encoding and encryption techniques that had previously been observed used by North Korean activity, but this was conducted by a Russian group. This is the North Korean code on the left and Russian code on the right. They were clearly trying to imitate previously conducted activity. They're trying to fool us as infosec professionals, and they were actually successful in some cases. I think now everyone realizes what actually happened. So false flags are something we often think about, and I wanted to share this quote, my favorite quote about this from Machiavelli. A military operation involves deception. Even though you are competent, appear to be incompetent, though effective, appear to be ineffective. This isn't actually a quote from Machiavelli. In fact, this isn't even a picture of Machiavelli, that's Isaac Newton. But the point is that the way information is presented and framed can definitely convince you of something, and I'm guessing some of you did not know that that was not Machiavelli when I read it. So this is actually a quote from Sun Tzu, because it's basically mandatory to have a Sun Tzu quote in a cybersecurity presentation. So So now I've talked about why this should matter to you guys. We're going to talk about social media and how it's kind of changed the game a little bit. First off, I wanted to bring up that there are a lot of platforms out there, some are US-based, but there are a lot of big ones that are not. The US-based ones often have significant populations in other countries. That means they have to balance concerns of doing business in those countries with doing business in the US. And you have laws that are different, you have norms that are different. It gets very, very complicated. I also wanted to point out that TikTok is a Chinese app. TikTok is the fastest growing app in the US, so something to be aware of. China definitely has different rules than we do. Everyone's paying attention, right? I can take this thing off, right? Cool. All right. I'm taking it off. All right. So this problem is not new. Influence operations existed with previous forms of media. There are there are things that have been spread over radio, over TV, over newspapers or via newspapers that would definitely qualify as an influence operation. But social media is different. It's different in a few different ways. One is that it's less expensive in a lot of ways. So in order to send out TV signal, you need a TV station. To broadcast radio, you need some kind of radio station as well. But for sharing content on the internet, you need a phone, maybe, or a computer, whatever means that you have to send stuff out. This also means that control of information is decentralized. You don't have a review process. You may not have fact checkers. You may not have folks calling up sources to double check information. You have lots of people contributing things. Information has been democratized, and obviously that in some cases lowers the quality. Yeah. There are lots of folks contributing content to social media. Yes, influencers are a real thing. We're going to kind of focus a little bit on state-sponsored activity because that's the one that's scariest and kind of most malicious sometimes. But there's definitely people doing it for profit, spreading the same kind of thing because it gets them clicks, it gets them money. I also wanted to point out that advertisers have a disproportionate voice in this medium because they're literally spending money to get your attention. And yes, there is a monetary value associated with your clicks, with your eyeballs. All of these folks are competing for it, and also this picture makes me think of zombies, so I wanted to include it anyway. Speaking of zombies, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a zombie in possession of brains must be in want of more brains. This is from the documentary Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. This is identical to influence operations, which are targeting brains. The activity on the internet is a means of transmission, but the brains are the goal. It spreads from brain to brain. There are more actors developing capabilities in this realm because they think it's working. People have seen past worldwide events. They say, oh, this is something we can do cheaply, that we're going to get into this game. It used to be just ISIS, Internet Research Agency, maybe that folks had heard of. But this is just a list, and this is just a subset of ones that have been officially taken down in some cases by platforms, and it's likely going to grow a lot more. So now that I've talked about social media a little bit, let's talk about some frameworks. First, let's talk about why frameworks, because not everyone's on board. Frameworks give us a way to do defense in depth. It gives us a way to describe this activity in a systematic way so people don't get confused talking to each other about what's going on. This example is the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, which I know everyone laughs because it's now a little bit long in the tooth, but it was groundbreaking. It gave people a clear idea of conventional hacking activity and how to counter it and treat it in a defense in depth means approach, and kind of make the whole thing systematic instead of chaotic. And we're going to talk about some frameworks for influence operations to attempt to do the same thing. Leading into that, micro-targeting is a way to specifically send information at individuals or a large group of people or a small group of people, depending on your desire. People self-reveal a lot of information about themselves online and also accidentally reveal that information, but some platforms give you the means to send information to a specific demographic, specific geography, and tailor your information accordingly. This is a micro-targeting campaign, and this is one way that social media has changed things, but it's also a reflection of adversary activity where they have delivered information, they see immediately how you react to it, and they can then change their tactics accordingly. In 2016, the Russian IRA had a campaign pattern like this of about 24 hours. And for those of you who have spent time in the military or are familiar with this kind of thing, this is an OODA loop. It's meant to describe what pilots go through when they're trying to shoot down an enemy aircraft. The decision-making process, reaction, and this is the same kind of thing, but obviously applied to the internet and influence operations. The next framework is, we're going to talk about bot activity. So some bots are easy to spot, like this one in the lower right that says, Eric Young, just a woman who loves Jesus. There's a lot of, we'll say, low-hanging fruit in terms of bots that people can easily spot, but that's not necessarily always the case. Bots are still a tool used by adversaries to amplify things that wouldn't necessarily travel organically. But not all the activity is automated. So I created a scale to describe the spectrum of automation based on the Pilot Authorization and Control of Tasks framework, which again talks about how pilots control planes either with autopilot or using manual controls. And the idea is that there's some fully automated bot activity that literally is just taking in information from other things happening on the internet and reacting to it. But there are a number of cases where activity is both automated and manual, or some parts of it are automated. And at the other end of the spectrum is sock puppet accounts, which is fake accounts or just official accounts that are being used to spread influence operations. All right, so back to this OODA loop for a second. This is the adversary. This is what they're doing. They've got longer-term goals in mind, and those are in the middle. They want to build up an audience so their message spreads more effectively. Maybe not too much of an audience, because if it gets too big, platforms may notice and take action. In general, they want to evade attribution, but there's an asterisk on that, which I'll explain in a second. Adversaries have started realizing that it's cheaper if they don't have to develop stuff themselves, if they can just find somebody who has a message that they want to spread, maybe they want to just create division. That's a common tactic. That allows them to kind of cut out the development process, and hey, now they're just amplifying folks that are carrying the message that they want to share. So the reason I put an asterisk on evade attribution is because bad guys have heard of the Streisand effect. Are you guys familiar with the Streisand effect? So this is where trying to hide something or make it not spread makes it spread more, to the point where this is now called the Streisand effect. So sorry, Barbara Streisand. The bad guys realize that when one of their campaigns gets taken down and a platform writes an article about it, hey, we took this down, that may provide more coverage than their campaign actually had. So it makes it may accomplish their task incidentally. The next model is a recruitment funnel. So ISIS, when they're trying to get people to participate in their activity, would recruit people on major platforms, would funnel them to less populated platforms to, get them involved in their community, would then use encrypted messaging to communicate with them more directly, and then finally physical contact. This mirrors the staircase to extremism, which maps the progression of somebody from peripheral involvement or feelings of sympathy to direct involvement, and then taking action on behalf of a group. So that can describe gang activity, it can describe white supremacist groups, it can describe any kind of community that is doing things, and that same kind of radicalization process. And this mirrors the marketing funnel. So let's say you like iPhones, and they're cool, but no big deal. But the more you use it, you're like, oh, this is kind of neat. Let me tell my friends about it. Let me go stand in line when it comes out. Let me just post about it nonstop or adopt that lifestyle, become part of the iPhone community. I'm just picking on iPhones, but this applies to a lot of different things. What's that? Yes, sure. Subaru. There are an infinite number of examples of this, but I'm not saying that marketing and ISIS are the same thing, but sorry, Claire. They are. The techniques involved in these things, the psychology involved in these things are definitely related. These are communities, and they are bringing people into the community and giving them a sense of belonging and involving them in this process, and that psychological phenomenon is definitely related. This also happens with politics, which I will touch on later carefully. So this is the title, the titular triangle. I'm going to attempt to say it, the epidemiologic triangle. This is from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. This describes how infectious diseases spread. The triangle does. I have here thrown attributes that describe why influence operations can spread as well in the same kind of viral way. These are all some factors, but there are lots and lots of other things. You could apply this to a significant influence operation, a single influence operation, sorry. So hey, this message spread in this community because the people have these attributes. This happened on this platform, which is connected in this way. This is a way to map out that activity. The triangle can also be used to describe things like asthma, which aren't necessarily infectious, but still have attributes explaining why something happened. The next framework is the Amat Framework. This is modeled on the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with. This is a screenshot of the GitHub page, so I encourage you guys to go out and check that out. This is put together by folks in the MISINFOSEC community and the Credibility Coalition, and the idea is to, I'm sure you guys can't read that, sorry, but I encourage you to go out and check out the website or the GitHub page. This is intended to granularly describe this activity and then give options and ideas around how you could counter it, how you could respond to it, and more accurately describe it. So now that we've talked about frameworks, I'm going to go into some state actor activity, starting with Russia. Shocking, I know. So in 2016, Russian influence operations used proxies such as WikiLeaks. There were also official media outlets involved, including Russia Today and Sputnik. They are still very active. They used combined, I'm going to do air quotes for this too, because that's a term I came up with myself pretty much, to basically hack, leak, and disseminate information. The hack and leak part was definitely conducted by the Russian GRU. That's been publicly attributed now. The dissemination activity was from the Internet Research Agency, which isn't technically associated with the GRU, but there's probably coordination. Advertising purchases. So the average advertisement on social media has a 1 to 3% click-through rate. The IRA's advertisements were getting a 10% click-through rate, so they were very effective with their advertising. They rapidly evolved their TTPs. So the IRA experimented with 100 different things. They were on Pokemon Go. They were on a zillion different platforms. They were trying videos. They were trying lots and lots of different things. 2016, there was targeting across the political spectrum. That is still the case. There was an article published very recently of targeting across the political spectrum. So there were Black Lives Matter pages, there were Texas secessionist pages, and everything in between. There are people who try to make this a partisan issue. It is not a partisan political issue in the US. This affects everyone. And yeah, I mentioned before how there are situations where adversaries want their operation to be revealed. This was definitely the case with the IRA. They did a Reddit thread where they just said, hey, we're the IRA, and ask us questions. All right, so this is a false flag operation, 2014-2015. APT-28, which is a suspected Russian APT group, was performing some hacking activity pretending to be the Cyber Caliphate. They attempted to conduct a destructive attack of a TV station in France. They successfully took over the US CENTCOM Twitter account, and there's an actual screenshot. I'm sure they weren't pleased by that. More recently, though, I'm guessing people heard about this because it's very recent. There was a revelation of a false flag operation where Turla, which is suspected Russian FSB, had been performing false flag activity as Oil Rig, which is an Iranian group. This was kind of mind-blowing, but they had been developing tools using the Iranians' code, had been using their infrastructure, and were stealing their victims, which is kind of mean, not gonna lie. Going back to APT-28 though, so yeah, 2016, there's this famous breach of the DNC and the associated leaks. Thousands of conventional media outlets were publishing leaked information on purpose, or they didn't know where it came from in some cases, but the traditional media was part of that activity. The dissemination piece of this was huge. There was thousands of accounts and bots. There were hours of video. There were 15 websites set up, and there was a video game. This is Killery. It's a Flash game that they created because they are definitely creative. According to the Senate report, and this is just based on data from Facebook and Twitter, 126 million Americans were exposed to content from this dissemination effort. I do not know the impact that this had, and to be honest, nobody does, because despite pollsters' best efforts, you cannot measure what's going on in people's brains. So this probably had an impact just because of scale, but nobody knows exactly what it was. So staying on politics a little bit, we're going to try and be sensitive here. I don't normally talk about politics in my presentations, but these are helpful examples. This is from the White House transcript. I'm going to use air quotes because it's not an official transcript. This was a conversation between the US president and the president of Ukraine. And it's not always easy to tell what the president is talking about, but in this specific case, he mentioned CrowdStrike, a server, and Ukraine. So it appears from this that the president believes a conspiracy theory that a physical server was taken from the DNC by CrowdStrike and taken to Ukraine because, according to the conspiracy theory, CrowdStrike is a Ukrainian company. Apologies to anybody here who works for CrowdStrike that you have to deal with this, but CrowdStrike is an American company. There was no physical server taken, but there's a conspiracy theory that the president, it looks like, believed enough to use it as part of a conversation with the Ukrainian president. He's acting on this belief. So how does he end up believing this? And the answer is this quote: I think. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Lenin didn't actually say this either. This is actually Joseph Goebbels, a famous Nazi. And to be honest, Goebbels didn't say this either. But once again, information presented in a convincing way can be something that we all believe. We are all susceptible to influence operations. This is not just, oh, that group of people, or oh, this group of people. We are all taking information presented to us and framed a specific way and accepting it based on our understanding of the world, and that is not something that we can do anything about. So now we're going to jump into China. Some scholars have described Chinese influence operations as the three warfares. So that's trying to influence public opinion, trying to psychologically influence how people will perceive a problem, and also they'll argue things in court as much as they possibly can, especially when it comes to South China Sea, which they will say belongs to them. China uses astroturfing, which is the fake generation of grassroots activity. This is not, the 50 Cent Army is not related to the rapper. So it's speculated that folks performing this activity on behalf of China get paid 50 cents per post. I don't think that's correct because you could probably make a lot of money at that rate. China uses human leverage where they can. They have an organization called the United Front, which has a number of different programs and elements that help spread their influence internationally. There's a lot of documentation about their economic and cultural influence, especially in Hollywood movies, and lately with tech companies, because there's a lot of concerns around the things having to do with Hong Kong and how people are dealing with those protests. China influence operations will often promote their official media outlets. They have both ones that are straight propaganda and ones that are more news-like, but just still have their take on things. China uses paid advertising. There's a famous example where they ran an ad in the Des Moines Monitor intending to influence sanctions policy. That prompted a tweet from the president in response. And more recently, there's been some evidence of stolen or sock puppet accounts. This particular one is a conservative news outlet. It had more followers than I will ever have in my entire life. But it was taken down as part of the effort to reduce their influence operation regarding Hong Kong. I'm not going to go too far into Iran. I did want to mention, though, that they were sending letters to the editor, posing as local politicians or local celebrities, and that was a way to get their voice in traditional media outlets by pretending to be somebody and just sending a letter to a newspaper and saying, hey, can you publish this in your opinion section? All right, so how do we respond to this? Hopefully, with this car, if one of you has this car, I want to drive it, but this is the right way to respond.
The Subaru?
I think it is. I think it is definitely a Subaru, and this person is probably a big Subaru fan. Platforms have a bunch of tools in their toolkit, and part of that is because they kind of own the territory of social media, so they can make changes to the environment section. Takedowns are kind of their biggest one. They'll take a whole bunch of accounts and just shut them down, or groups, and often write up the results. The way they find out about them is tips from other folks, but also people using a platform abuse reporting mechanism. So some platforms have a button you can press to say, hey, this is suspicious. Please use that. Not everyone actually realizes it exists. And on some platforms, it doesn't exist. But when it's there, use it. Platforms, they use content filtering or shadow banning to reduce the reach of some things that they find undesirable. They use They frequently make changes to algorithmic amplification stories because these are often gamed. Historically, they were very, very gamed, but platforms have gotten better about not amplifying things that really should not be trending. We talked about bots a little bit. There are a whole bunch of ways to detect bots. Humans tend to be awake during some hours and do certain things at certain rates. Those are the low-hanging fruit for platforms to detect activity, but they still take down. I think Facebook announced something like 1 million a day. In the name of stopping bots, some platforms are putting things like CAPTCHA to make it harder to just create random accounts. They'll give you more context around an advertisement or a news story to hopefully let you make your own decisions about it. I don't know how many people actually click through to see who's sending them information, but at least that option is there for you. And then human moderators. There are news articles about human moderators getting PTSD or becoming radicalized from the terrible things that they have to look at all day. That is really not good, but in order to combat this kind of problem, they kind of have to exist, unfortunately. There is some requirement for human direct decisions on some content. So what are platforms actually doing? We talked about takedowns and the articles that they write up about them. Some of the platforms are actually taking action on bot activity. Twitter is still 20% bots, at least, but they are finally taking action to kind of cut down on that. Pinterest realized that they had a problem with anti-vaccination rhetoric, so they changed how their search results worked, so people who were not spreading misinformation about vaccination would also have a voice. This is the most common platform reaction, though. They don't want to deal with this problem. It's a drag on their resources, and it's a headache in the media, and they really would rather not have to deal with it. So there are a number of platforms that just don't deal with it. So what other options are available? Law enforcement can infiltrate some distributed groups like ISIS, like Anonymous. Anonymous still exists, but they're not as effective as they used to be or as scary. No offense if anyone from Anonymous is in the room, please don't mess with me. But this solution is unlikely to work against a state-sponsored activity coming from a building in Russia, because it's from a building in Russia and infiltrating it is not easy. Speaking of a building in Russia, though, indicting people and conducting hacks on their infrastructure is a way to respond. These are of limited utility. Nobody indicted in this indictment, in this particular one that I've got a screenshot of here, is likely to go anywhere where they will be extradited. So they'll never see jail time from this, but it'll still call attention to the activity, and hopefully taking down their internet does actually have some impact. So what do I recommend for you guys specifically? First off, please think about what you post on social media. Think about what you believe on social media and what you read. Use resources like Media Bias Fact Check to look for bias, to look for reliability of information. Both of those are something that you can get from that website, but also by just kind of double checking things. I encourage you guys to tip things that you find to platforms or to other folks that can actually respond to it. Please go to this GitHub page and contribute. If you want to fork it, if you want to build something from it, that would be awesome. And please support researchers, people who do fact checking, because they are also helping solve this problem or solve some aspects of this problem. Please check out DFR Labs. They're part of the Atlantic Council. They do fantastic work around influence operations. So, quick summary of what I talked about. Definitions. why this matters to you guys. We talked about social media. We talked about the frameworks to help describe this. Went through some state actors, and we talked about response options. And I just want to leave you guys with this quote, this definitely real quote from Taylor Swift that this is actually from Swift on Security, who's a fantastic Twitter account that everyone should follow. That's my presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
So that quote, why did you write the quote 4 pages back?
Yeah. Nobody knows. It's lots of people have said similar things, but that actual quote, nobody actually knows who originally said it.
How did they appropriately attribute that one source code segment to Russia, the one that was intended to be a false flag for Korea?
So they made a bunch of mistakes. They had some things that made no sense that they had tried to false flag. There was a piece of code inside that was encrypted, but there was no reason to encrypt it in that manner. They had a number of techniques that overlapped with previous destructive attacks from APT-28 in general, or the subgroup that I think Olympic Destroyer is attributed to, which I believe is Black Energy or Sandworm Team. There's a number of different ways, and then I think there were some governments that kind of weighed in, and governments have their own methods of attributing things. So, yes?
So a lot of the recommendations that you gave sort of at the end kind of rely on a particular worldview. There is something that you can call the truth.
Yes.
And perhaps you were going with this. In a highly partisan, environment like we have now,
Yeah.
people seem to have their own version. So part of what we're doing here is we're trying to inoculate people using the epidemiological approach. Is it possible in this environment to use this particular worldview of the truth and PolitiFact and Snopes, or do you have to appeal through the separate kind of versions of the truth on the left and the right, their best interest to kind of come to something else called truth?
That is a very good philosophical question, which I think I'm not going to be able to give this is the correct answer, yeah. But I can say that there are things that can be objectively proved to be true, and there are also ways to convince people of things, though it can be extremely challenging when people have completely different frames of references and completely different sets of facts that they're operating from. There are tricks with empathy. There are ways to appeal to logic. There are various ways to approach that, but there are definitely arguments that I don't bother getting into with people because I'm just not going to be able to change people's mind as well. There's no objective correct answer to your question, but I do think, and maybe I'm just being optimistic, that this is not a lost cause, and we don't have to just live in separate bubbles and just pretend that everyone who doesn't agree with me is crazy. I don't think that's the correct way to operate.
How does the U.S. influence operations line up with the evolution that you described from Russia, China, to Iran, to Moderators?
So you're asking what activity being performed by U.S. government, is that correct? I'll be honest, I don't actually know because I have no visibility into that. I will say that the U.S. government does some things officially through websites, through communication with the media. So my slide earlier about Turla and Oil Rig was published by the NSA along with the NCSC, which is the UK's version, and they're putting this message into the media through official channels, but I have no idea what the U.S. is doing covertly. Yes.
Who has the great presentation, by the way?
Thank you.
Who has the better sustained information operations campaign? The entire Russian intelligence entity or Fox News?
How do you tell the difference? No, I'm kidding. I do want to emphasize that there are some things about, every single outlet and every newspaper that are almost every single newspaper and outlet that are actually, like, they're doing good reporting sometimes. So Shepard Smith just left Fox News, and I have nothing but admiration for Shepard Smith's reporting. There are other folks in that organization who I think do great work, and I don't want to just dump on them as like a source of conspiracy theories and craziness. There are folks in Russia that suck at what they're doing as well. So I'm going to say it's a tie. No, I don't know. I can't give a real answer because they are different, and they're both doing what they see is right, even if I disagree often. Yes. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Along those lines of questioning.
Yeah.
I've read that Taiwan and some of the Nordic countries, like Finland,
Yes.
have a long history with Russia with those operations. They've come up with a strategy on how to best deal with those kind of operations.
Yeah.
And it's deliberate. There's nothing hidden. It's not a secret operation. But they've figured out a way how to deal with these things successfully.
Yeah. So I'm going to repeat the question because it's an excellent question. Honestly, these have all been excellent questions. This sir in the back was talking about how Scandinavian countries and Taiwan have received an incredible amount of targeting of influence operations and have figured out kind of strategies around handling it. The best strategy that they have is having societies that do not have giant fissures in them for adversaries to take advantage of. There are also things you can do with your educational system to help people develop media literacy, help people think critically about what they're reading and consuming. But the biggest thing is to not have gigantic vulnerabilities for your adversaries to take advantage of. And that kind of applies in InfoSec as well. If you have a gigantic vulnerability in your infrastructure, then your ability to stop your adversary is limited. Is that helpful? Okay. Yes. Sir, hey, John.
Hey, Dan, good talk.
Thanks.
You're researching the Facebook Russian activity. Did you come across any of the information related to the groups that they would like micro-target for actual in-person rallies and then sort of like hand it off to a U.S. person? Because I'm not sure people understand there are real world consequences to not understanding this problem. I don't know, you didn't mention it, so I don't know if you came across that.
Yeah, the comment was about there was some news articles about how the Russian IRA had tried to develop protests basically across the street from each other for competing organizations, and also get like individuals to physically start protests in the U.S. So I think there was a black rights group that they were attempting to actually have a real protest and maybe turn it violent. They had limited success with that, but it's absolutely a significant goal for adversaries to have real, tangible, real impact that isn't just changing minds on the internet, that will actually probably manifest itself more in the future, though maybe not in quite as overt ways of let's have two protests across the street from each other and see if we can start some violence that way. Yes, sir.
You mentioned a lot of states, a lot of nations. Do you have any input on Cambridge Analytica? Do you think they played a lot into this?
They were absolutely trying to create more effective targeting based on all the information that they had collected. I don't know how much impact they had because, again, I can't see into the brains of the people that would have voted one way but ended up voting another way because of advertising targeting from the Cambridge Analytica data. They're an example of a for-profit organization that's definitely trying to get into this kind of game, and that is also likely to continue. But I don't know how much impact they had, sorry. Any other questions? Okay, thank you guys, thank you for coming.